The first warning was the snap of a rifle round breaking the air. It cut past an apartment block and sent a sheet of dust drifting from a shattered window frame. On a gray morning in Sarajevo, residents who had stepped outside for water dropped to the ground and pressed their faces into the cold pavement. The hills surrounding the city were barely visible through the haze, but everyone knew what waited up there. Serb positions dug into the ridgelines, rifles trained on the streets below. A woman clutching 2 plastic jugs froze mid-step, trying to decide whether to run or stay still. The silence between shots was worse than the gunfire itself. It meant the shooter was searching for the next target. When the siege began in April 1992, no one expected it to last more than a few weeks. Sarajevo had hosted the Winter Olympics just 8 years earlier. Its streets had been full of crowds, laughter, and flags waving from balconies. Now the city was cut off on all sides. Serb forces formed a ring around the valley, seizing the high ground and closing every road leading in or out. Snipers set up on Mount Trebević, Vrasa, and other vantage points overlooking the city's neighborhoods. Mortar crews dug into positions where they could drop shells into the center of town without ever exposing themselves to return fire. As the days stretched into months, the routines of normal life collapsed. Electricity flickered out. Water systems failed. Residents learned to collect rain and melt snow on small stoves fed with scavenged wood breadlines formed before dawn. Families tore apart old furniture to use as fuel. Schools closed. Hospitals filled with the wounded and the dying. The sound of sirens eventually stopped, not because the danger had passed, but because there was no longer anyone left to operate them. One of the most dangerous places in the city became a 4-block stretch along Zmaja od Bosna Street. Snipers positioned above the railroad tracks watched every movement there. People sprinted across intersections, heads down, breath tight in their chests. The locals named it Sniper Alley. Anyone passing through knew to move fast and never backtrack. Drivers kept their foot on the gas even when traffic snarled, weaving around burned-out cars left where they'd been hit. Pedestrians waited behind concrete barriers until the moment felt right, then bolted across open ground while others shouted warnings from nearby doorways. Life continued, but never at a normal pace. People adapted to the constant threat. They learned to judge the direction of incoming rounds. They memorized the intervals between shell barrages. Parents held their children close whenever they stepped outside, shielding them with their own bodies. Funerals took place at dawn or after dusk, when snipers had more difficulty seeing. Graves were dug quickly, sometimes in parks or courtyards, because cemeteries were too exposed. In 1993, the city reached one of its darkest points. Mortar fire pummeled the Markel marketplace, killing dozens of civilians who had gathered to buy whatever food they could find. The explosion tore through fruit stands and shattered every window on the street. Blood pooled in the gutters. Families rushed to the site looking for loved ones, stepping through debris while shells continued to fall nearby. Images of the aftermath traveled across Europe within hours. The world saw them, saw the wounded, the dead, the smoke drifting above broken stalls, but still, the siege continued. Despite the danger, Sarajevo's residents refused to surrender the rhythm of their lives. Musicians held underground concerts in basements where the acoustics were dampened by sandbags. Artists painted murals in ruined buildings. A small theater group staged plays by candlelight, their voices rising above the rumble of distant gunfire. Weddings took place in hidden courtyards. Couples exchanged vows under the threat of falling mortars, because life still had to move forward, even in a city under siege. Aid convoys arrived sporadically, protected by United Nations personnel who had limited authority to intervene. Food, medicine, and supplies were brought in through the airport, but the distribution centers were often shelled. Long lines of civilians waited outside, knowing that even a single mortar round could turn the area into another Markal. Still, they waited, because the alternative was starvation. By 1994, a lifeline emerged beneath the city. Engineers and volunteers from the Bosnian army dug a tunnel under the airport runway, connecting Sarajevo to territory beyond the siege lines. It was cramped, muddy, and barely tall enough to stand upright in, but it allowed supplies to enter and the wounded to be evacuated. People carried flour sacks on their backs through the narrow passageway, their shoulders scraping against the wooden supports. Soldiers moved ammunition and medical equipment under the feet of international peacekeepers stationed above who were restricted from interfering. For many, the tunnel was the only reason the city survived as long as it did. As the siege dragged into its third and fourth years, the psychological toll deepened. Residents flinched at every distant crack of gunfire. Children who had grown up during the siege knew the sound of mortars better than the sound of applause. Families gathered in hallways when shelling intensified, sitting shoulder to shoulder while plaster shook from the ceiling. People slept in rooms with no windows because glass shards had become deadly projectiles. Even in the rare, quiet moments, dread hung over the city like a fog. In August 1995, a second massacre at the Markal market forced the world to confront what Sarajevo had endured. Another mortar exploded in the heart of the crowd, and again the images circulated across television screens. This time, the response was different. NATO launched airstrikes against Serb positions, targeting artillery sites surrounding the city. Over the following weeks, pressure mounted on the forces maintaining the siege peace negotiations began, and by the end of the year, the Dayton Accords were signed. In February 1996, the siege finally ended. The ring around Sarajevo broke after nearly 4 brutal years. Survivors emerged from basements and shelters, blinking in the pale sunlight. For some, it was the first time they had walked freely in their own streets without fear of sniper fire. People gathered in the central square, hugging strangers, crying openly, and stepping carefully around the scars left behind. Bullet holes in every wall, buildings reduced to skeletons, memorials rising in places where mortars had landed. But liberation didn't erase the trauma. Over 10,000 civilians had died. Many more carried wounds that would never fully heal. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Families remained separated or permanently altered. Yet Sarajevo stood. It had endured the longest siege in modern history, not through military strength, but through the stubborn will of ordinary people determined to keep living. Today, the city bears the marks of what happened: the chipped facades, the red Sarajevo roses painted over mortar scars, reminders of the years when stepping outside the door meant risking death. But it also carries the memory of resilience, of neighbors sharing what little they had, of musicians playing in dark cellars, of weddings held under falling shells, and of a spirit that refused to surrender even when the world seemed content to watch from afar. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.